Thing says we're live now. It's a lovely day in Dunedin. A perfect day to get some recording done. This is where all the magic happens. Here's my little recording booth. Thought you might like a look at that. Sorry, just the incredibly professional handheld phone style of streaming. Inside the booth, there you go. You can see my microphone suspended up there. Got my little tablet. Some lights that are so pro, and my headphones with the gaffer tape holding the band together because this job pays so very, very well. There we go. We'll slip you into your little nook there. Hopefully that'll be okay. That's a little bit high, isn't it? Unfortunately, there's not a lot I can do about that at the moment. Yeah, this is the first time that I've done this for a long time. So there's going to be a few little bumps while we figure some stuff out. Let's see if I can shove that button. There you go. Look at that. Perfect. Flawless. Beautiful. All right. So today we are recording. I'll just do this for a few minutes. Don't worry. I'm not going to make you suffer through the whole thing. Today we are recording Chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby. So you're going to hear the Marvel quote that is my American accent. It's not great, I have to say, but, we have to do these things. As an voice actor, with a Yeti Blue microphone, which is the same model that I've been using this whole time. It's pretty basic. You don't have to spend a fortune to get this stuff done. If you're willing to spend the time. There we go, just checking that the input is set to the Yeti, because I did send a recording the other day to Maciej, a long-suffering editor, that was just recorded through the inbuilt microphone on the tablet here, because the recording software decided to switch it over without asking me. All right, so headphones times. As well as live streaming, I'm also just recording this flat. So I hope this looks okay and everything, by the way. Like I said, I haven't done this for a long time, so I don't know. I am recording this, and I will, in a moment when I hit record, you'll hear the voice quality suddenly improve a lot as I overlay this recording in the edit. Okay, enough waffling, Stephen. Get on with your work. I shall now proceed to pretend that you are not here, okay, so I can just focus. The American accent is not easy for me. Okay. Chapter 7. It was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in the house failed to go on one Saturday night. Again, sorry. It was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in the house failed to go on one Saturday night. And as obscurely as it had begun, his career as Trimalchio was over. Only gradually did I become aware that the automobiles which turned expectantly into his drive stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. Wondering if he were sick, I went over to find out. An unfamiliar butler with a villainous face squinted at me suspiciously from the door. "Is Mr. Gatsby sick?" After a pause, he added, in a dilatory, grudging way. Sorry, an aside to the audience here, Maciej. I record all the characters separately, so his voice, the butler that I was just talking to, is on a different track, and then Maciej blends it all together, so I can keep the accents and voices solid and unchanging, unlike Brave New World, where John's voice changed completely from the start of the book to the end of the book. Okay, so after a pause, he added, in a dilatory, grudging way, "I hadn't seen him around, and I was rather worried. Tell him Mr. Carroway came over," he demanded rudely. Caraway. Abruptly, he slammed the door. My Finn informed me that Gatsby had dismissed every servant in his house a week ago and replaced them with half a dozen others who never went into West Egg Village to be bribed by the tradesmen, but ordered moderate supplies over the telephone. The grocery boy reported that the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and the general opinion in the village was that the new people weren't servants at all. Next day, Gatsby called me on the phone. "Going away?" I inquired. "I hear you fired all your servants." So the whole caravanserai had fallen in like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. I see. He was calling up at Daisy's request. Would I come over to lunch at her house tomorrow? Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned and seemed relieved to find that I was coming. Something was up. And yet I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a scene, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined. In the garden. The next day was broiling, almost the last, certainly the warmest, of the summer. As my train emerged from the tunnel into sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. The straw seats of the car hovered over the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist, and then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into deep heat with a desolate cry. Her pocketbook slipped to the floor. She gasped. I picked it up with a weary bend and handed it back to her, holding it at arm's length and by the extreme tip of the corners to indicate that I had no designs upon it, but everyone nearby, including the woman, suspected me just the same. Said the conductor to familiar faces. My commutation ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in this heat, whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. That anyone should care in this heat, whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as we waited at the door. Roared the butler into the mouthpiece. What he really said was... He set down the receiver and came towards us, glistening slightly to take off our stiff straw hats. He cried, needlessly indicating the direction. In this heat, every extra gesture was an affront to the common store of life. The room, shadowed well with awnings, was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch, like silver idols weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. They said together. Jordan's fingers powdered white. Powdered. Jordan's fingers powdered white. Jordan's fingers powdered white. Powdered. Dear Americans, how do you speak? It's hard. All right. Jordan's fingers powdered white. Jordan's fingers powdered white. Powdered. Every now and again, I come across a phrase that's nigh on impossible. Elderly man was the last one. Very hard. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. "And Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the athlete?" I inquired. Simultaneously, I heard his voice, gruff, muffled, husky, at the hall telephone. Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed, her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. Whispered Jordan. We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. Said Daisy cynically. No, he's not, I assured her. It's a bona fide deal. I happen to know about it. Tom flung open the door, blocked out its space for a moment with his thick body, and hurried into the room. He put out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. Said Daisy. As he left the room again, she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. She murmured. Said Jordan. Daisy looked around doubtfully. Cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch just as a freshly laundered nurse leading a little girl came into the room. She crooned, holding out her arms. The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. Gatsby and I, in turn, leaned down and took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before. Said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy. Her face bent into a single wrinkle of the small white neck. Admitted the child calmly. Daisy turned her around so that she faced Daisy turned her around so that she faced Gatsby. Explained Daisy. Daisy sat back upon the couch. The nurse took a step forward and held out her hand. With a reluctant backward glance, the well-disciplined child held to her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door, just as Tom came back, preceding 4 gin rickeys that clinked full of ice. Gatsby took up his drink. He said, with visible tension. We drank in long, greedy swallows. Said Tom genially. He suggested to Gatsby. I went with them out to the veranda. On the green sound, stagnant in the heat, one small snail crawled slowly toward the freshers. Sail, not snail. Oh, my God. On the green sound, stagnant in the heat, one small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. Caw. Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dog days along shore. Slowly, the white wings of the boat moved against the blue, cool limit of the sky. Ahead lay the scalloped ocean and the abounding Blessed Isles. Said Tom, nodding. We had luncheon in the dining room, darkened too against the heat, and drank down nervous gaiety with the cold ale. Cried Daisy. Jordan said. Insisted Daisy, on the verge of tears. Her voice struggled on through the heat, beating against it, molding its senselessness into forms. Tom was saying to Gatsby. Demanded Daisy insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. She cried. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. She repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized. and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. She went on innocently. Broke in Tom quickly. He got up, his eyes still flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. His temper cracked a little. His hand, trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. Oh, God. His hand, trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. She objected. She begged him. He didn't answer. She said. They went upstairs to get ready, while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, changed his mind, but not before Tom wheeled and faced him expectantly. Asked Gatsby with an effort. A pause. Broke out Tom savagely. Called Daisy from an upper window. Answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. I remarked. I hesitated. He said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it. The jingle of it, the symbols... The jingle of it, the symbols... The jingle of it, the symbols' song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. Tom came out of the house Tom came out of the house, wrapping a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan wearing small, tight hats of metallic cloth and carrying light capes over their arms. Suggested Gatsby. He felt the hot green leather of the seat. Demanded Tom. The suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby. He objected. Said Tom boisterously. He looked at the gauge. A pause followed this apparently pointless remark. A pause followed this apparently pointless remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and with indefinable expression, at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognizable, as if I had only heard it described in words. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression, at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognizable, as if I had only heard it described in words, passed over Gatsby's face. Said Tom, pressing her with his hand toward Gatsby's car. He opened the door, but she moved out from the circle of his arm. She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the unfamiliar gears tentatively, and we shot off in the oppressive heat, leaving them out of sight behind. Demanded Tom. See what? He looked at me keenly, realizing that Jordan and I must have known all along. He suggested. He paused. Bus. He paused. The immediate contingency overtook him, pulled him back from the edge of theoretical abyss. He continued. Inquired Jordan humorously. Confused, he stared at us as we left. said Jordan helpfully. He was incredulous. Snorted Tom contemptuously. Demanded Jordan crossly. We were all irritable now with the fading ale, and aware of it, we drove for a while in silence. Then, as Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. Said Tom. Objected Jordan. Tom threw on both brakes impatiently, and we slid to an abrupt dusty stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed hollow-eyed at the car. Cried Tom roughly. Said Wilson, without moving. Tom demanded. With an effort, Wilson left the shade and supported the doorway and, breathing hard, unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. He said. Inquired Tom. Said Wilson as he strained at the handle. Wilson smiled faintly. Exclaimed Tom, startled. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. The coupe flashed by us with a flurry of dust and the flash of a waving hand. Demanded Tom harshly. Remarked Wilson. The relentless, beating heat was beginning to confuse me, and I had a bad moment there before I realized that so far his suspicions hadn't alighted on Tom. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him, and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before. And it occurred to me that there was no difference between men, in intelligence or race, so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty, as if he had just got some poor girl with child. Said Tom. That locality was always vaguely disquieting, even in the broad glare of afternoon, and now I turned my head as though I had been warned of something behind. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil. But I perceived, after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. In one of the windows over the garage. Is that right in American? Have we got any Americans in the audience that can help me? Garage, is that how you'd say that? What would the alternate? Garage? Garage. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I think garage, right? I'll record them both and make sure it's okay later. In one of the windows over the garage, the curtains had been moved aside a little. And Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. So engrossed was she that she had no consciousness of being observed, and one emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a slowly developing picture. Her expression was curiously familiar. It was an expression I had often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realized that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. That's the end of a scene and start of a new scene, so we'll fade out completely and then into the next sound effects when they're in the car, I think. Sorry, water. And Rog. Garage? Really? Garage? Garage? Wow. American is weird. It's a collection of a bunch of different European accents, and they go together strangely. Okay, cool. Next scene. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind, and as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot whips of panic. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitously from his control. Instinct made him step on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind. And we sped along toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour, until, among the spidery girders of the elevated, we came in sight of the easy-going blue coupe. Suggested Jordan. The word sensuous had the effect of further disquieting Tom, but before he could invent a protest, the coupe came to a stop, and Daisy signaled us to draw up alongside. She cried. She complained. Whoops. You'd think that alarm would be silent when the phone's in use, but no. Okay. Where are we? Okay. She cried. She complained. With an effort, her wit rose faintly. Tom said impatiently, as a truck gave out a cursing whistle behind us. Several times he turned his head and looked back for their car, as if the traffic delayed them. And if the traffic delayed them, he slowed up until they came into sight. I think he was afraid they would dart down a side street and be out of his life forever. I think he was afraid they would dart down a side street and out of his life forever. But they didn't. And we all took the less explicable step of engaging the parlor of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. The prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into the room eludes me, though I have a sharp physical memory that, in the course of it, my underwear kept climbing like a damp snake around my legs, and intermittent beads of sweat raced cool across my back. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and pretended to think, that we were being very funny. The room was large and stifling, and though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back to us, fixing her hair. Whispered Jordan respectfully, and everyone laughed. Commanded Daisy without turning around. Said Tom impatiently. He unrolled the bottle of whiskey from the towel and put it on the table. Remarked Gatsby. There was a moment of silence. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed to the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, I'm not sure if she recorded that or not. I'll do that one in the line. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed to the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, "Excuse me," but this time no one laughed. I offered. "Oh, I'll pick it up," I offered. Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered, in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. Said Tom sharply. Said Daisy, turning around from the mirror. As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. Cried Jordan dismally. Daisy remembered. He answered shortly. Appended Jordan. After a moment, she added as if she might have sounded... After a moment, she added as if she might have sounded irreverent. I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis, I remarked. The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a long cheer floated in at the window, followed by intermittent cries of "Yeah!" and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. No, the end of that again. Followed by intermittent cries of "Yeah!" and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. Said Daisy. Jordan warned her. He concentrated with an effort. She denied. Jordan smiled. Tom and I looked at each other blankly. Biloxi? First place, we didn't have any president. Gatsby's foot beat a short, restless tattoo, and Tom eyed him suddenly. A pause, then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his "thank you" and the soft closing of the door. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. Once more on that bit. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. Said Gatsby. Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his unbelief, but we were all looking at Gatsby. He continued. I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I'd experienced before. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. She ordered. Any word that has like two R sounds in it is very difficult in an American accent if you're not native. Ordered. Elder. Elderly. I had to do that like 8 times in one of the previous chapters. Elderly gentleman was very difficult. He continued. No, we've done that. Sorry. She ordered. Snapped Tom. Gatsby said politely. They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. Repeated Tom incredulously. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone as the last. He saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. Murmured Jordan. Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete. Began Gatsby, but Daisy guessed at his intention. She interrupted helplessly. I got up. Said Gatsby. Exclaimed Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. He cried. At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive firmness that we remain, as though neither of us had anything to conceal. As though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions. Tom's voice groped unsuccessfully for the paternal note. Said Gatsby. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. Said Gatsby. But there was no laughter in his eyes. Sorry again. But there was no laughter in his eyes. Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. He exploded. He exploded. Said Gatsby, shaking his head. He nodded sagely. Said Daisy. She turned to me, and her voice, dropping an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. He said earnestly. She looked at him blindly. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing, and as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. She said, with perceptible reluctance. Demanded Tom suddenly. From the ballroom beneath, muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. There was a husky tenderness in his tone. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. No. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. She said, but her hand, as she tried to light a cigarette, was trembling. Suddenly she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Put the match out first. Anyway. She cried to Gatsby. She began to sob helplessly. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. He repeated. Said Tom savagely. The words seemed to bite physically into Gatsby. He insisted. She admitted in a pitiful voice. Agreed Tom. She turned to her husband. She said. Said Gatsby with a touch of panic. Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now. She said with visible effort. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Cried Daisy. Broke out Tom. said Gatsby steadily. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. Said Gatsby politely. Cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. That unfamiliar yet recognizable look was back again in Gatsby's face. Continued Tom slowly. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring, terrified, between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object. On the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. For a moment, the set of his face could be described in just that For a moment, the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made, but with every word she was drawing further and further, there's that double R sound. Yeah, so hard. All right. But with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and the only dead dream fought on that afternoon. And the only dead dream fought on. And only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice across the room. The voice begged again to go. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone. Said Tom. She looked at Tom, alarmed now, but he insisted with magnanimous scorn. They were gone, without a word, snapped out, made accidental, isolated, like ghosts, even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in the towel. I didn't answer. He asked again, "What?" "No, I just remembered that today's my birthday." Construction. I can hear hammering outside. Can you hear that? Gosh darn it. All right. Okay, I'll call it there. Damn it, we're like one paragraph from the end of the scene too. But I can't record while that's going on. Is it going to keep going? Yeah, it is. There's some utility truck parked out the front of our house at the moment that's just full of tools, so someone's doing some work nearby. Go on, grab your tools and go away. Let me finish this bit. Damn it. All right, I'll record this last paragraph, and Maciej, if you can let me know if the background noise is too bad, I'll re-record it in my next session later. I was 30. Before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe with him and started for Long Island. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing. But his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind. 30. the promise of a decade of loneliness, a thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me, who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder. And the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. It's the end of another scene, start of another one, so we'll fade out completely. Come up with the next one, which is outside the garage. And the tragedy continues. Yay! Gatsby, what a cheerful story. Great. Okay, we'll stop that. 42 minutes and incomplete. Eesh, it's a big one. Thank you very much for those of you who have joined us for this little recording session. See a little bit about how the sausage is made. As you can see, I record it all in chunks, and it gets put together in post after being cleaned up and fixed up. Either I do it or Maciej does. Hello, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Yes, that's me. I would do those voices, but I can't remember them at all. Jekyll would have just sounded like me. I always make the main character sound just like my normal voice. It's easier. Yeah, excellent. I hope you've enjoyed this. We will, do something again in the future, I guess, if this was fun for people. Sorry I didn't finish the whole chapter. Bit of a pain. Anyway, have a great day. Bye.